因为你知道我模害什么人吗？我曾经用一个辩来，无论证据如何呈现，你们都不会判起诉，请举手，没有举手。
有可能。
那这种都已经是 disqualified。
我们以下就进入到评论的阶段。
证据如何呈现，
正式开始举手。
美国承认这是一个可以考到的可以。
对啊。
在开始我的评论之前，
因为我不是只有单纯的反对死刑，我是说你反对死刑没有关系。
但是你可能会因为反对死刑就判他有罪。
而且无论证据如何呈现，还给我举手。
我们会请这种引子陪审团的朋友先告诉引子陪审团评论到最后得到的答案是什么，他们的宣判是什么。是不是请
合宪哦，这样拿掉是合宪。
啊，对了，你如果已经问到这个合宪。
好，麻烦你告诉我们你们的评论的结果。
博恒凯无罪，然后詹新雅无罪，都是一致的那个。
接受任何缺陷。
对。
那怎么可能呢？无合理怀疑讲啊。
无合理怀疑不是
100%。
那要求你们引子陪审团这边
无合理怀疑不是指 no doubt。
你们引子陪审团有请6个人，好，谢谢。这是供参考了啊，这6个人要达成一致就比较容易，9个人就比较困难一点啊。但是因为我们今天时间比较有限了，我想如果在真实的案例里面的话，蔡法官会跟他们讲说，你们评论到半夜都没有问题。那也许在继续评论下去就会有一个一致的结论出来。那只是因为我们今天是因为效果的关系，所以我们必须让我们必须要配合这个场地跟这个时间，因此我们就只好在这个时间把它卡下来。所以得到2个都是 hung jury 的结果，但是我想这没有关系了，这也是一种测试啊，让我们知道说在一致决的情况下，假使时间不够的话，甚至可以 hung jury 的。好，那我们现在就开始进入评论的时间。那我想当然大家最希望的就是能够知道Iscoe法官对于这场模拟审判给我们的评论跟意见。那我们以下是不是就请Iscoe法官给我们评论跟意见？谢谢。
谢谢。This is the first time as a judge that I have ever seen a complete mock trial and then full jury deliberation.
作为法官，这是我第一次看到一个真正全程参与一个模拟审判，然后也是第一次看到完整的陪审团的评议过程。
And I want to say, first of all, I was very impressed by the quality of the attorneys and by the quality of the judge, who I've come to know over the past week, and he did a terrific job.
法官说，他认为参与这场模拟审判的法官还有2造都表现得非常好。
One of the things that's interesting to me is that the shadow jury found the defendants not guilty fairly quickly, while the larger jury was hung, unable to decide after deliberating for a longer period of time.
他觉得他一个很有趣的一点是shadow jury 很快的就可以达成一致的决定，但是呢，我们真正的陪审团反而花了比较久的时间，可是却没有办法达成一致的决定。
So I want to talk about several different things. The first one is some of the issues that the jurors seized upon that the lawyers might not ever have thought about.
法官说他今天要强调几个点就是律师或者是2造都没有注意到的，反而是我们素人的陪审员有注意到的部分。
One thing that I found particularly interesting was one juror said 3 bricks of heroin is too much heroin to fit into the container.
法官说他觉得最有趣的一点是，有一个陪审员就指出，本案的3块的海洛因砖，好像没有办法放进那个饼干盒里面。
And it goes to show you that for the prosecution, you have to carefully go through everything, because if the jury doesn't believe that, they're going to find the defendant not guilty.
那这个就是对检察官一个警惕啊，就是检察官一定要从头到尾仔细的把你的事实建构清楚，因为如果你没有的话，那陪审员就很有可能会就是做出一个无罪的判决。
It also shows that lay people not experienced in the law, when working together, come up with some very good substantive issues.
那这也显示出素人在大家通力合作下，还是可以就是找出一些不错的实质上的争点。
Another thing that the jury mentioned, and that I would have mentioned had I been a lawyer in this case, was why didn't the police wait to see what the female did with the package once it was delivered to her?
另外一个法官想要提到的是，就是有一个陪审员提到，然后如果他是辩护律师，他也会提到的，就是说，为什么警察不多等一阵子，等到说这个女性被告她收到包裹以后，她会怎么处理这个包裹
But the jury picked up on that issue, and I think the argument they were making, some of them, is if the police had waited, we would have known if she, exactly what she did with it. That might have helped figure it out. But they didn't bother. They arrested her right away, and now they're making the jury guess there's a reasonable doubt.
那就是在这个争点呢，两造并没有提出来，那是这个陪审员所提出来的。那就不禁让我们会有这样的怀疑说，如果警察是不是多等一阵子，然后让这个女性被告看是要怎么处理这个包裹，那我们就会知道说，就有更多资讯说他跟那个男性被告之间的关联性是什么，那会不会就更容易做出决定
？Another issue that came up was one juror talked about his personal experience being interrogated by the police, and he generalized from that experience as to what could have happened in this case.
那还有一个有趣的点是，有一个陪审员他有提到他自己那个本身的经验，就是被讯问的经验，然后呢，他把这样的经验套用在本案的情况中。
So that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it shows that he's bringing life experiences to the jury. And second, if you're selecting jurors, you may want to know about those life experiences.
那这个就显示有两点很重要的部分。第一个部分是他把他这样子的人生的经验带进jury，所以是好的。但是呢，另外一方面对律师来讲，律师也应该要在选择陪审员的时候就知道，就要问说你有没有被询问过这件事。
So if you're conducting a voir dire, you may want to ask, have you ever been questioned by the police?
在陪审员的筛选过程当中，那个辩护律师就应该要问说，你是不是被警察讯问过
And both sides need to know that, because their answer may be, I was questioned and they threatened me and they beat me, or it may be they questioned me and they were extremely polite and nice and friendly. Either way, you want to know if that juror would be bringing his or her experience.
那对两造来讲，这种问题都是很重要的，因为呢，这个潜在的陪审员可能会说，我之前被讯问过，然后我被打过，我被强暴威胁过，那陪审员也有可能会讲说，我虽然被讯问过，但是我的这个整个经验很好，讯问者是很有礼貌的，那所以对两造来讲，这样的问题都是很重要的。
What's also interesting is watching the jurors, and you see that some issues that are very important to a couple of jurors are not very important to others. But when they all start talking, they put their opinions together and come close, in this case, to reaching a verdict.
在讨论过程当中，有一些每一个陪审员他的那个就感觉上表现出的那个重要性是不太一样，但是他们最后还是能够就是那个把所有人的意见容纳进来，然后呢做出包含所有人意志的决策。
But I think all of these questions raised by the jurors, and I'm sure you can think of more, all of them suggest arguments that lawyers for one side or the other could have made to the jury.
那不管是持什么样看法的陪审员，他们大概都是在讲说，如果是在本案中，的律师或者是检察官应该还可以做出什么样的抗辩，或是怎么样的主张，可以让这个事实变得更清楚。
They also show how seriously the jury took reasonable doubt. It's, as I listened to the jury, there seemed no question that they thought both of the defendants were a little bit shady, there was something vaguely criminal about them, but not enough to find them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt for most of the jurors.
那这个评议过程也显示，陪审员对于那个要达到有罪的新证明这个门槛是很认真看待的。好，那个大概所有的陪审员都能够就是感觉到说，这两个被告好像都有点怪怪的，但是呢，他们都能够清楚的认知到说，这样怪怪的感觉并没有办法直接就跳到有罪的新证。
And now I want to talk about one fundamental legal issue that would have led me to grant a verdict for one of the defendants before the case ever reached the jury.
那法官现在要讲一个很重要的法律上的争议。那这个争议必须要，就是这个争议在把这个案子交给陪审团决定之前，其实就应该要先解决的。
I think if I were representing the female defendant, I would argue to the judge at the end of the government case, there may be evidence that she knew there was something illegal in that package, but there's no evidence that shows beyond a reasonable doubt that she knew it was heroin.
那法官说，如果她是女性被告的辩护人的话，那他会主张说，就算这个女性被告知道这个包裹里面可能是还有违法的东西，但是呢，本案中并没有任何证据显示这个女性被告知道这个里面的东西可能是毒品。
I would have argued maybe she thought it was stolen diamonds. Maybe she thought it was an ancient vase. Maybe she thought it was something else illegal of great value. But she was not charged with smuggling. That charge was dropped. She was charged with importation of heroin.
那在本案中，因为这个女性被告她是被指控是在运输毒品嘛，那实际上她有可能是认为说里面可能是非法的钻石啊，或者是里面可能是非法的古董花瓶之类的，但是就是在整个案件中，并没有任何证据能够达到 beyond a reasonable doubt 的程度，说证明被告知道说这里面的确是毒品。
Okay, those are some general observations. I want to now get into some legal specifics, and the first one is again related to heroin.
法官他现在要转向一些比较法律层面的问题。那第一个问题是关于海洛因。
As I watched the evidence during the entire case by the prosecution, there was no evidence that the substance in the container was actually heroin. There was a confession introduced that, if believed, would show the male defendant thought it was heroin, but there was no scientific evidence proving it was heroin.
那在本案中，好像没有看到有实质上科学上的证据证明说这个找到的东西的确是海洛因。好，那我们有一个自白，但自白也只是证明到说被告觉得这里面是海洛因，但是并没有一个客观的证据说找到的东西的确是海洛因。
Now, that's a problem that's easily corrected, but I wanted to identify it that the government must prove every element of a crime in its case in chief.
在检察官在做他的 case in chief 的时候，好，那检察官就应该要完整的呈现这个犯罪中的每一个构成要件。
So the standard is, did the government introduce evidence that, if believed by the jury, could lead the jury to convict? In this case, there was no evidence that it was actually heroin.
那在本案中并没有非常明确的证据说找到的这个东西的确就是海洛因。
That can be easily corrected in the next case. But I should mention that in the United States, introducing a report that says it is heroin is not enough.
那虽然这个问题很容易就可以被纠正，好，但是在美国的话，光是提出一份报告说这个是海洛因是不够的。
Until a few years ago, it was enough in the United States because the defense always had a right to call a witness to say that it was not heroin or the report was unreliable. But the Supreme Court has now said you must have a chemist or a scientific expert to prove that a drug is heroin, to talk about a DNA test, or to introduce other scientific evidence.
那美国现在的法律就是规定说，如果你要呈现这样的证据的话，那你一定要找一个化学家，好，或者是鉴识方面的专家来证明说这个东西的确就是海洛因。
So there has to be a live witness.
所以一定要有一个人作证，证明这件事情才行。
A few other observations I want to make. At the beginning, there was a discussion between the judge and the lawyers about whether the evidence would come in about both facts relevant to sentencing and facts relative to guilt.
在本案开始之前呢，那个法官跟两造有曾经做出一个讨论，啊，然后讨论说哪些证据是跟事实相关的，哪些证据是跟量刑相关的。
Under the American system, those have to be separate inquiries because the burdens are different, and evidence that may be relevant at sentencing is often not relevant at the guilt phase, and I'll give you some examples.
在美国的话，认定事实跟量刑是绝对要完全分开的。好，那有些证据在量刑的时候是有关联性的，那有些证据在那这样的证据在认定事实阶段不一定是有关联性的。那法官接下来会举出一些例子。
There is lots of evidence that would come in at sentencing that would both be good or bad for the defendant that isn't relevant at all in determining whether he or she committed the crime.
有些证据在量刑的时候会纳入考量，好，但是这样的证据在认定事实的时候不一定是相关联的。
For example, evidence that the defendant had a horrible childhood and was beaten by his parents would not come in at the guilt phase.
例如在决定事实的时候，这个被告小时候呢曾经被虐待，然后呢曾经被那个家暴，哈，但是这样的证据在认定事实阶段就是不会进来的。
Similarly, in the United States, evidence that the defendant was a bad person, that he had many juvenile arrests, that he beat up small children, things like that, would be very important in sentencing, but of no relevance at all in determining guilt.
那如果被告呢有在青少年时期犯了很多罪，然后呢欺负其他小朋友等等，这些行为呢在量刑的时候是有相关联的，但是在认定事实的时候是不会让他进来的。
And there's a much lower standard for sentencing. At sentencing, the judge just determines whether evidence is reliable, and the judge can rely on lots of inadmissible evidence, evidence that would not meet the standards for admissibility in a criminal trial.
在量刑阶段呢，法官针对这些相关联的资讯，它的标准比较低，好，常常就是在审判过程中是没有证据能力的证据，其实也可以在量刑的程序中纳进考量。
But as it happened in this mock trial, there was virtually no evidence that would apply only to sentencing. So it made no real difference, but I wanted to identify the legal issue.
在本案中呢，这个不是一个争点呢，基本上没有哪一个证据是专门针对量刑阶段，法官只是想要点出这个问题而已。
Another time I thought there was going to be a problem, but there wasn't, was when Judge Tsai began to give a summary of the evidence before the trial began.
另外一个可能的问题是，蔡法官在一开始在审判开始就针对本案做出一个介绍性的陈述。
And I was afraid it would be a overly long, biased summary that would influence the jury.
那法官那时候听着听着就很担心，说是不是会太长然后呢，里面太具有偏见，然后影响到陪审团的判决。
And actually, I should explain, with this excellent judge, I really didn't think it would be a problem. But I thought it could be a problem with some judges. It was definitely not a problem here. It was a very short and neutral explanation of the evidence.
但还好，蔡法官最后就做出一个非常中性还有中立的陈述。但是呢，法官要强调的是，如果是其他法官的话，就不一定是这样子咯。
In the United States, the only thing the judge would say at the very beginning of the case would be something like, this case is about the government's charge that there has been distribution of heroin on such and such a date by the mailing of a package. And that would be it.
在美国的话，本案的审前的陈述，法官在审前的陈述就只是会限缩于说，本案是一个毒品运输案，发生在几年几月几日，然后呢，使用的方法是邮件，然后仅此而已。
And both defendants are entitled to give a theory of the case. So the female defendant would probably say her theory is she merely mailed a package and had no idea what was in it.
那因为两个被告都有权利提出自己的抗辩，那对女性的被告来讲，那她的主张可能就是她只是寄了一封信而已，寄了一个包裹而已，她完全不知道里面是什么。
And the male defendant would say the female defendant made everything up and is just trying to blame it on me.
那男性的被告可能就会主张说，一切都是女性被告她自己做的，跟我没有关系。
And that brings up another problem that the judge and I have talked about a lot, which is, shouldn't this case have had the defendant in one trial, defendant A in one trial, and defendant B in a separate trial?
那这也就牵涉到另外一个问题，就是法官跟蔡法官之前有讨论过的，在本案中是不是应该要分成两个审判进行？
And my concern would be if each side is saying it wasn't me, it's the other one that's guilty, that a jury would decide, well, they both must be guilty.
那法官说，这个时候他会担心的是，如果两边都在说，都是对方的错，那这个时候 jury 会不会比较倾向认为两个人都是有罪的？
And that's what the prosecution often counts on. Of course, it was not a problem here because one jury found them not guilty and one jury found them mostly not guilty.
那在本案中没有发生这样的情况，因为shadow jury 刚刚是决定都是无罪的。那在我们这个 jury 的话，我们这个陪审团的话，大多数人都是认定那个被告是无罪的。
A couple of other very minor things. We would give the preliminary instructions would be very brief. They were much more detailed in this trial and got to legal standards.
法官说还有几个小的问题，在美国的话，审前的这个介绍性的陈述会非常短，通常不会讲到法律实质的规定的问题。
Our preliminary instructions would basically be, don't do independent research, keep an open mind, don't start deliberating before all the evidence is in.
那法官说，在美国的话，这个审前的介绍性陈述大概只会强调说，不要自己陪审员不要自己担任侦探，然后呢，要等到所有证据都进来以后再做决定，然后要保持对所有证据都保持开放的心胸。
Okay, so those are some things. I want to get to one fundamental difference in this trial